Our app is really coming together now. It looks well laid out, I think. All we're missing is a button to perform some actions. Over in our toolbox, let's hit Button and drag in a button from under Controls. Do not drag in the bar button item. This is a special button that sits in the top navigation bar of our apps, and we're not going to cover that yet. So click the plain button, drag and drop it in, and what I'm going to do is just zoom in, and I'm going to position that button relative to some other elements. I'm going to double click it first of all. Whoops, not that. I was trying to double click it to change the text, but it appears you can't do that with a button anymore, so simply select the button, come to the Properties panel. First of all, let's give it a name. Let's call this simply Button with a lowercase b, and then we can change the title text of it. Let's call this Transport. You'll see why I've called it that in a minute. Now let's add some constraints. I'm going to pin it to the right side of the label, and I'm going to make that roughly 20. I'm also going to give it a width, so we have enough room to actually see the text on the button. Let's give it a width of about 65. That should do it. And then finally, I'm going to, whoops, I've double clicked by accident again. I am actually going to pin it to the top of my label here. And I'm just going to drop that down a little until my orange outline kind of lines up with it all. Then I'm going to click the Update Constraints button. If it works. There we go. So obviously I need a little more width on this. Let's give this a width of 80. And it's worth bearing in mind here that the smallest screen you will ever have to play with, I believe, is 320 across in width. And the smallest height is 480. And that corresponds to the old iOS devices that were 3.5 inches. Chances are you won't actually want to support the iPhone 4 or 4S for much longer. So always make sure your elements fit across the screen. So we have our button. We've given the button a name. How do we get that button to fire off some events? Well, let's open up our viewcontroller.designer, and you'll notice the button is set in there as an outlet. This just gives us a reference to the button. Okay, open up your view controller, and we want this method viewDidLoad to set our button click handler. Now, why do we set it in here? That's because viewDidLoad only loads once, regardless if it goes off screen, on screen, background, whatever. viewDidLoad only loads once. So it's the ideal place to do one-off tasks, and the following is a one-off task. We want to grab our button, touch up inside. So if I scroll down, we have these little E icons, and they tell us that these are events. And if you double click one, we can enter plus equals. We can pass it over a sender and some event arguments. Open our curly braces and close them. So this method will fire off when our button is clicked. Why are we putting it inside viewDidLoad that only loads once? That's because if I put this inside of something like view will appear, that touch up inside event gets added to the button each time the view appears. So .NET doesn't say you can only have one touch event, it says you can have as many as you like. And if you put it in view will appear, make the app go away, then come back, it'll add another touch event, so everything will get fired twice. I'll show you what that means by actually showing it in the simulator. Inside touch up inside, let's have console.writeLine, and let's have clicked to send ourselves a nice simple message. Let's hit play and run this on our iPhone 5 simulator. So it takes a little longer to build than Xcode does, but that's okay. So now let's hit transport, pop over to Xamarin, open our app output, and we have clicked written there. And of course that happens once each time I click it, so now there should be 3. Okay, stop that running and come back to our view did load. If we remove touch up inside and start to type touch, we have all kinds of events. So if a touch is cancelled, once the touch goes down, once the touch down is repeated, there are many events. One of my favorites is actually drag exit. So if I double click this and then hit play, the button will now behave a little bit differently. And I've used this feature before on quite a few apps. So if I click it, come over to Xamarin, there is no output. What we have to do is click and hold, drag down. And inside of application output, we have clicked. Now, why is that? That's because touch drag exit means we've held it down and exited from the button. And I say this is handy because you can use it as a selector. If you want to open a folder or something, you can click something, flick down, and something else opens. So don't be stuck with the idea of a button as a simple click item. There are many things you can do with buttons in iOS, so I'd advise you to explore all of these options.